My dad told me I should pay him back for the child support he gave my mom. For years, I believed I was in debt to the man who raised me. Then I discovered the truth about how much he actually paid, and everything I thought I knew about my childhood crumbled into pieces. My name is Amanda, I'm 28 years old, and this is the story of how I spent over a decade believing I owed my father my entire paycheck, only to discover that he had been manipulating me from the very beginning. Looking back now, I can see that my childhood wasn't normal, but when you're living it, you don't have anything else to compare it to. My parents divorced when I was 8 and my sister Lily was 6. The custody arrangement seemed fair at the time, 1 week with mom, 1 week with dad. What I didn't understand then was how this simple schedule would become the foundation for years of emotional manipulation and financial control that would shape every decision I made well into my 20s. I remember the first time Dad mentioned the money. We were sitting in his small apartment kitchen, and I was probably around 10 years old, struggling with my math homework while Lily watched cartoons in the living room. Dad was going through a stack of papers, muttering under his breath about bills and expenses. He looked up at me with this expression I'd learned to recognize over the years, part frustration, part self-pity. "Amanda, you know how much money I pay your mother every week for you and Lily?" he asked, his voice carrying that tone that made my stomach twist with anxiety. I shook my head, not really understanding what he meant. $20 a week. Every single week. That's over $1,000 a year, just for you two. Even at 10, I could sense this was supposed to make me feel guilty about something, though I wasn't sure what. He continued, spreading the papers in front of me like evidence in a court case. "Your mother is bleeding me dry, Amanda. She's taking all my money and spending it on herself while I can barely afford groceries." This became our weekly ritual during my stays at his place. Dad would pull out his folder of documents, court papers, bank statements, receipts, and show me exactly how much money he was being forced to give my mother. He'd explain how unfair the system was to fathers, how women always got the better deal in divorces, and how someday, when I was old enough to work, I should consider paying him back for all the money he'd spent on raising me. "It's only fair," he'd say, putting his arm around my shoulders in what felt like affection but now I recognize as manipulation. "I'm not saying you have to, sweetheart, but it would be the right thing to do. After everything I've sacrificed for you girls." The worst part wasn't even the guilt he made me feel about the money. It was how he positioned my mother as the villain in every story. According to Dad, Mom was greedy, selfish, and manipulative. She was the reason he couldn't afford nice things, the reason he lived in a tiny apartment instead of a house, the reason he seemed so stressed and unhappy all the time. "Your mother doesn't care about you the way I do," he'd tell me during those kitchen conversations. "She just sees you as a paycheck. But I love you girls more than anything, which is why it hurts so much when she takes advantage of my love for you." I believed every word. How could I not? He was my father, and children are programmed to trust their parents. Plus, he was so convincing in his victimhood, so detailed in his explanations of how the legal system had wronged him. He had papers to prove it, numbers to back up his claims, and a narrative that painted him as the loving father being taken advantage of by an ex-wife who only cared about money. As I got older, the pressure intensified. When I turned 16 and got my first job at a local coffee shop, Dad started making more direct comments about the money. "Now that you're working, Amanda, maybe you could help out a little bit. Nothing major, just maybe contribute to some of the child support I'm paying your mother." I was making minimum wage, working 15 hours a week around my school schedule, but I started giving Dad $20 every other week. It felt like the right thing to do, especially since he made it clear that this was voluntary and showed how mature and responsible I was becoming. "Most teenagers your age are selfish," he'd say, pocketing the 20. "But you understand family responsibility. Your mother never taught you that, you got it from me." The dynamic in our house during my weeks with Dad was unlike anything that happened at Mom's place. At Mom's, I was expected to do normal teenage chores, keep my room clean, help with dishes occasionally, take out the trash. But at Dad's apartment, I somehow became responsible for everything. I cooked dinner most nights because Dad claimed he was too tired from work. I did the grocery shopping because he said I was better at finding deals. I cleaned the apartment because he worked so hard to pay for it that he deserved to relax when he got home. Most significantly, I became responsible for taking care of Lily. During our weeks at Dad's place, I made sure she did her homework, gave her baths, read her bedtime stories, and mediated when she got upset about the constant tension in the apartment. Dad would disappear into his bedroom to watch TV or talk on the phone, leaving me to handle whatever crisis or need arose with my 6-year-old sister. "Amanda, can you deal with Lily? She's crying again," became his standard response to any parenting situation. Whether she was hungry, scared, lonely, or just needed attention, I was expected to step in and handle it. When I tried to suggest that maybe he should spend more time with her, he'd get defensive. "I spend time with both of you girls," he'd argue. "But I work all week to pay your mother's child support, and I need some time to decompress. You're old enough to help out with your sister. It's called being a family." The guilt was constant and overwhelming. If I complained about cooking dinner every night, Dad would remind me how much money he was spending on food for us. If I mentioned that I wanted to spend time with friends instead of cleaning the apartment, he'd point out that he was sacrificing his social life to have us there. Every normal teenage desire for independence or social interaction became evidence of my selfishness and ingratitude. "Your mother has really done a number on you," he'd say whenever I pushed back against his expectations. "She's turned you against me and made you think you're entitled to everything without giving anything back. But that's not how the real world works, Amanda. In the real world, you have to contribute to the family that's supporting you." The breaking point came when I was 17 and working as a server at a busy restaurant downtown. I was making decent money for a teenager, sometimes $50 or $60 a night in tips, and Dad started paying very close attention to my income. He'd ask detailed questions about how much I'd made each shift, and he'd calculate how much I should be contributing to the household expenses. "You're making more money than some adults, Amanda," he said one evening after I'd had a particularly good night at work. "I think it's time you started paying your fair share around here. Maybe you could cover groceries during your weeks here, and also help me catch up on some of that back child support I've been paying all these years." I was exhausted from working 30-hour weeks on top of my senior year coursework, but I agreed to start paying for groceries and giving him an additional $50 every week. It felt overwhelming, but he made it clear that this was what responsible adults did, and that my mother had never taught me about financial responsibility the way he was doing. "This is how you learn to be independent," he explained as I handed over nearly half my paycheck. "Your mother just takes money without teaching you anything about earning it or appreciating it. But I'm preparing you for the real world." The real world, according to Dad, was a place where everyone was trying to take advantage of you, where you had to fight for every dollar, and where the only people you could trust were family members who had proven their loyalty through financial sacrifice. In his narrative, he had proven his loyalty by paying child support for years, and now it was my turn to prove mine by paying him back. What I didn't realize at the time was how different things were during my weeks at Mom's house. Mom paid for groceries, cooked most meals, did the laundry, and generally handled the adult responsibilities of running a household. She never asked me to contribute financially to rent or utilities. She never made me feel guilty for eating food or using electricity. She never positioned herself as a victim of the divorce or tried to turn me against Dad. The contrast should have been obvious, but Dad had spent so many years conditioning me to see Mom's behavior as evidence of her selfishness rather than her generosity. According to him, Mom could afford to pay for everything because she was getting so much child support from him. She wasn't making any real sacrifice because she was essentially spending his money, not her own. "Your mother has it easy," he'd remind me regularly. "She gets hundreds of dollars from me every month, plus her own salary, while I'm barely scraping by after paying her child support. Of course she can afford to buy groceries and pay for your phone, she's doing it with my money." This narrative was so deeply embedded in my thinking that even when I started noticing inconsistencies, I explained them away. Like how Mom somehow managed to pay for our private school tuition, which was several $1,000s a year, while Dad claimed he couldn't afford to buy name-brand cereal. Or how Mom replaced our winter coats and school uniforms every year without complaint, while Dad made me feel guilty for needing new shoes. The cognitive dissonance became impossible to ignore during my senior year when I started researching colleges and financial aid. Mom was filling out forms and gathering tax documents, and I got my first real look at both of my parents' financial situations. Mom was making about $40,000 a year as an administrative assistant, while Dad was making nearly $60,000 as a sales manager. But the really shocking discovery came when I found the original divorce decree in Mom's filing cabinet while looking for tax forms. I wasn't snooping intentionally. Mom had asked me to grab some documents for the financial aid application, but there it was, the legal document that outlined the custody arrangement and child support payments that had shaped my entire adolescence. According to the court order, Dad was required to pay $15 per week in child support. Not per child, total. $15 per week to support 2 children. For context, that's about the cost of 2 large pizzas or a single trip to the movies. Over the course of a year, it amounted to less than $800 total. I stared at that document for a long time, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. For nearly a decade, Dad had told me he was paying significant amounts of money to support Lily and me. He had shown me bank statements and receipts, complained about the financial burden, and convinced me that I owed him thousands of dollars in back payments. But the actual court-ordered amount was so small that it wouldn't even cover our weekly grocery bill. Even more shocking was the realization that many of the expenses Dad had attributed to child support weren't actually part of his legal obligations. Our private school tuition had been decided before the divorce, and both parents had agreed to maintain our enrollment. Mom was paying the entire tuition cost, over $8,000 per year, without any contribution from Dad. She was also covering our health insurance, dental care, swimming lessons, school uniforms, and most of our clothing costs. The only things Dad was legally required to pay were that $15 per week and half of any extraordinary medical expenses over a certain threshold. Everything else, and there was a lot of everything else, was being covered by Mom's $40,000 salary. I felt physically sick as the reality of the situation sank in. For years, I had been giving Dad money that I earned from working nights and weekends, believing that I was helping him recover from the financial burden of raising me. I had felt guilty for eating food at his apartment, guilty for needing school supplies, guilty for existing as his daughter. But he had been paying less than the cost of a weekly grocery run while positioning himself as a financial martyr. The manipulation went even deeper than the false financial claims. Dad had created an entire narrative about Mom being greedy and selfish, but the evidence was right there in black and white. Mom was covering nearly all of our actual expenses while asking for nothing in return, while Dad was complaining about a payment so small that it wouldn't cover a single school uniform. I confronted him that weekend during what would turn out to be my last stay at his apartment. I brought a copy of the divorce decree and spread it on the same kitchen table where he had spent years showing me his proof of financial hardship. "Dad, I found the original court order," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "The child support is $15 per week total, not the hundreds you've been talking about." His reaction was immediate and telling. Instead of embarrassment or apology, he became defensive and angry. "That document doesn't show everything, Amanda. There are other expenses, other agreements that aren't written down. Your mother has been taking advantage of me for years, and now she's turning you against me too." I pressed on, despite the familiar guilt rising in my chest. "What other expenses? Mom pays for our school, our insurance, our clothes, everything. What exactly are you paying for besides the $15? "I pay for food when you're here," he said, his voice getting louder. "I pay for utilities, rent on a bigger apartment so you girls have somewhere to sleep. I pay for gas to drive you places, for activities, for things your mother conveniently forgets to mention. But Dad, that's just normal parenting stuff. Mom does all of that too, plus she pays for everything else. And I've been giving you money because you told me you were struggling with child support payments." This was when his mask really slipped. "You don't understand what it's like to be a man in this situation, Amanda. The system is rigged against fathers. I shouldn't have to pay anything to your mother, you girls are my children too. But the courts always favor women, so I get stuck with these payments while she gets to play the hero. $15 a week isn't exactly breaking the bank, Dad. It's not about the amount," he exploded. "It's about the principle. It's about your mother using you girls to control me and take my money. And now she's poisoned you against me too. After everything I've done for you, all the sacrifices I've made, this is how you repay me." The conversation spiraled from there, with Dad pulling out all his familiar manipulation tactics. I was ungrateful, I was just like my mother, I didn't understand how hard he worked or how much he had given up for us. But for the first time in my life, these arguments felt hollow and desperate rather than convincing. I realized that I had never actually seen evidence of these sacrifices he constantly referenced. His apartment was small, but it was in a nice neighborhood and well within his means based on his salary. He drove a reliable car, ate out regularly, and had money for hobbies and entertainment. His lifestyle didn't reflect someone who was being financially drained by child support payments. More importantly, I started recognizing the pattern of emotional manipulation that had shaped our entire relationship. Anytime I had needs, questions, or boundaries, Dad would respond by positioning himself as the victim and me as the ungrateful daughter. He had trained me to prioritize his feelings over my own well-being, to accept responsibility for his happiness and financial security. The final straw came when I told him I wouldn't be giving him money anymore. "Dad, I need to save for college, and I don't think it's fair for me to pay you back for child support that was legally required and actually amounted to very little money." His response was swift and cruel. "Fine, Amanda. If that's how you want to be, then don't bother coming back here. Your mother has turned you into a selfish, entitled brat, and I'm done enabling it. When you grow up and realize what you've lost, don't come crying to me." That was 3 years ago, and I haven't spoken to Dad since. The immediate aftermath was difficult. I felt guilty, confused, and worried that I had made a terrible mistake. Lily continued staying with him for a while, and she would come back with messages about how hurt and disappointed he was, how he couldn't understand why I was being so cruel to him. But as time passed and I gained distance from the situation, I began to see just how unhealthy our relationship had been. I talked to friends about their relationships with their divorced parents, and none of them had ever been asked to pay back child support. None of them had been made to feel guilty for existing as their parents' child. None of them had been assigned adult responsibilities as young teenagers. I also started noticing things about Dad's relationship with Lily that concerned me. She was now the one handling most of the household responsibilities during her stays with him. She was the one listening to his complaints about money and being made to feel guilty for normal teenage expenses. She was being positioned as the good daughter who understood him, unlike her selfish sister who had abandoned the family. The situation with Lily has been one of the most heartbreaking aspects of this whole experience. She's now 20 years old and has been living primarily with Dad for the past 2 years. She dropped out of college after 1 semester, claiming she couldn't handle the stress, and has been unemployed for over a year. Meanwhile, Dad just paid for her to take a week-long vacation to Bali, the same man who used to claim he couldn't afford groceries when I was living there. When I pointed out this inconsistency to Lily, she defended him exactly the way I used to. "He's in a better financial position now," she said. "And he wanted to do something nice for me after everything I've been through." I can see the same pattern of manipulation and dependency that I experienced, but magnified. Lily has been convinced that she can't make it on her own, that she needs Dad's support and protection, and that questioning his version of reality would be a betrayal of their relationship. She's become completely financially dependent on him while he maintains the narrative that he's the generous, loving parent who sacrifices everything for his daughters. The cruel irony is that Dad is now in a position to be genuinely generous with money, but he's using that generosity as another tool of control. He can afford to pay for Lily's expensive vacation because he spent years paying minimal child support while letting Mom cover all of our actual expenses. He built his current financial stability partly on the back of Mom's sacrifices and my unpaid labor as a teenager. Looking back, I can see that I was never really Dad's daughter in the traditional sense. I was his emotional support system, his household manager, his financial contributor, and his scapegoat for his resentment about the divorce. He never saw me as a child who needed protection, guidance, and unconditional love. Instead, I was a resource to be used and a debt to be collected on. The saddest part is that I spent so many years believing his version of our story. I thought he was a devoted father who was being taken advantage of by an unfair legal system and an ex-wife who didn't appreciate his sacrifices. I thought I was lucky to have a dad who cared so much about teaching me responsibility and preparing me for the real world. I thought my feelings of guilt and anxiety were normal parts of growing up in a divorced family. It took me years to understand that loving parents don't keep running tabs on what their children owe them. They don't position their children as competitors with their ex-spouses. They don't assign adult responsibilities to teenagers and then claim credit for teaching independence. They don't use their children's natural desire for approval and love as leverage for financial gain. Real love, the kind I see between Mom and me now, the kind I'm learning to build in my romantic relationships, doesn't come with conditions or payment plans. It doesn't require you to choose sides or prove your loyalty through sacrifice. It doesn't make you feel guilty for having needs or boundaries. I'm still working through the psychological impact of growing up with Dad's manipulation. I struggle with setting boundaries in relationships because I'm used to prioritizing other people's feelings over my own well-being. I have a hard time asking for help because I was trained to see neediness as selfishness. I sometimes feel guilty for spending money on myself because I was conditioned to see my own expenses as burdens on other people. But I've also developed some strengths that I'm proud of. I can spot manipulation and emotional blackmail from a mile away. I have a strong work ethic and financial independence that nobody can take away from me. I understand the difference between genuine sacrifice and performative martyrdom. Most importantly, I know what kind of parent I want to be if I ever have children, the kind who protects rather than exploits, who gives rather than keeps score. The relationship with Dad is permanently severed, and I'm at peace with that decision. I don't miss the anxiety and guilt that came with trying to maintain his approval. I don't miss feeling responsible for his emotions and financial security. I don't miss walking on eggshells around someone who claimed to love me but treated me like a burden. What I do miss is the idea of having a father, someone who could have been a source of unconditional support and guidance during some of the most challenging years of my life. I miss the relationship we could have had if he had seen me as his daughter rather than his debtor. But I've learned that grieving the parent you needed is healthier than accepting the parent who hurts you. Lily still visits me regularly, though our conversations are often tense when the topic of Dad comes up. I try to be patient with her because I remember how convincing his manipulation can be, especially when you're isolated from other perspectives. I hope that someday she'll see the situation more clearly, but I've learned that I can't rescue someone who doesn't want to be saved. For now, I'm focused on building a life that's truly mine. I have a career that I chose based on my interests rather than my ability to pay back imaginary debts. I have relationships based on mutual respect rather than financial obligation. I make decisions based on what's best for my well-being rather than what will keep other people happy with me. The little girl who used to sit at that kitchen table, feeling guilty for eating food that her father provided, has grown into a woman who understands her worth. I don't owe anyone an apology for existing, for having needs, for setting boundaries, or for refusing to accept mistreatment in the name of family loyalty. My dad told me I should pay him back for the child support, but what I learned was that some debts are imaginary and some people will use love as a weapon if you let them. The best thing I ever did was stop paying a debt I never actually owed and start investing in the life I deserved to live all along.